Hello and welcome to this documentary on Mongol siege warfare. When it comes to the history of the Mongols, they are often viewed as a barbaric people that spread a plague of destruction and misery throughout the eastern and western world. Often people consider them to be merely horse-riding barbarians, uncultured and uncivilized, unlike those societies that they devastated. Then the question is raised, how were they able to conquer societies of people who are prepared defenses to protect themselves from their enemies? How had the Mongols been able to capture castles, cities, and other fortifications when they were a nomadic people? The answer to this is their siege warfare tactics that they developed over decades as their empire expanded. As the Mongols introduced more people to its empire, they made sure to put the engineers of these captured states to work constructing better and more efficient siege equipment. This in turn meant that the Mongols were able to adapt their siege tactics to account for these new technologies. Starting in the early 1230s, Mongol siege warfare was fairly primitive, relying on simple catapults to chip away at defenses before it was finally time for the infantry to rush in and take the city. This would prove to be very ineffective against stone wall defenses and would result in the Mongols having to participate in a long siege until the enemy finally was worn down enough to surrender. However, this required a massive amount of resources and time, which was something not available to the Mongols. When faced with wooden or less advanced defenses, the Mongols were able to make quick work of any city due to their ability to maintain a high level of morale. As the decades continued, their techniques became more advanced, becoming able to more efficiently trap an enemy behind their walls and storm their defenses. This was in part due to the new engineering capabilities that they had available from their conquest of China. Finally, as the enemies of the Mongols started to develop new techniques for the defense of their cities, the Mongols were able to mobilize their engineers and resources to change their tactics and build new siege equipment that would outpace the development of any defense. The siege of Kaifeng occurred in 1232 and involved the Mongol army led by Suadai against the Jurchen army stationed within Kaifeng. This siege is a perfect representation of early Mongol siege warfare, as it did not involve the storming of fortifications followed by the sacking of the city. Instead, the Mongols were forced to enact a prolonged siege over many months until the morale, food supplies, and cohesion of the residents fell apart. This lack of ability to break down the walls of Kaifeng was due to the Mongols employing only rudimentary catapults that were loaded with large rocks. While being fired over the walls, this technique was effective at inflicting some casualties within the civilian population, in addition to intimidating the Jurchen wall defenders. This would not provide sufficient power to break down a wall, though. Large siege equipment was not the only siege tactic employed in battle, however. Mongols were facing a technology superior enemy, and the Jurchen used this to their advantage by employing gunfire and fire against Mongol troops attempting to reach the walls of the city. To counter this as best they could, the Mongols made shields out of cowhide and built trenches up to the walls of their city. This allowed them to be protected from many of the missiles being launched at them by the defenders. The siege of Kaifeng shows how limited the Mongols were with their siege techniques during the early years of their empire. Moving ahead a decade, let's take a look at the siege of Erstrom, which was a battle between the army of Hungary and the Mongol army under the control of Batu. The events surrounding the specific siege are a little different than when the Mongols faced off against the Jurchen. This is because the Mongol state was not being as technologically advanced as the Jurchen were when it came to defending their cities. This meant that many of their fortifications were mostly made from wood or earth, with a simple moat around the castle to further slow down any attacker. The walls of the city were made of wood and were quickly destroyed by the Mongols' use of heavy stones in their catapults. This initial success, however, did not last, as the citadel in the center of the city was made of stone. Similar to the siege of Kaifeng, the catapults that the Mongols used were very ineffective at battering down stone walls. This meant that Batu changed tactics and attempted to forcefully storm the citadel multiple times. Each of these attacks failed as the Mongols were decimated by the Hungarian crossbowmen due to their lack of protection. The Mongol army also did not have the resources during this campaign to enforce a lasting siege against the city, as they had at Kaifeng, meaning they eventually retreated. The siege of the city highlights the technological strengths of Mongol siege equipment at the time, but also highlights the drastic shortcomings the Mongols had. Now looking towards the Mongol campaign against the Muslims, there is a siege of Baghdad. While the siege is historically important for a variety of different reasons, the siege tactics used by Halgu are going to be the main focus for the discussion. In January of 1258, the Mongols began their siege of the city by first breaking dikes and flooding the ground around the Caliphate's army to prevent them a chance of escape or rescue. Then the Mongols sent his Chinese engineers to construct catapults, a ditch, a palisade, a battering ram, and siege tower. All that siege equipment was meant to breach the city walls in various different ways. In just 5 days, the Mongol forces were in control of a significant portion of Baghdad's defenses, and this caused the surrender of the city to come shortly after. This siege clearly shows how the Mongols employed far more advanced siege equipment and significantly effect it had on the battlefield. Instead of relying on catapults to attempt to knock down the walls of the cities, now the Mongols were able to utilize the Chinese engineers under their control. This resulted in far more effective siege equipment being produced and allowed the Mongols to easily isolate the city while they were sieging. Additionally, it also meant that any defenses would not be as effective due to the multiple different ways the Mongols could now deal with them. The final siege that we'll be looking at in this documentary is the siege of Xiangyang, which took place from 1267 to 1273. The siege involved the Yuan Mongols against the Song dynasty, with the Mongols bringing along their standard trebuchets, which will be an important detail later. The Song had prepared for the Mongol attack and had installed netting to catch any projectiles launched from their trebuchets, in addition to extending their moat, so the Mongols could be forced outside the city and outside the effective range. This meant that the Mongol siege equipment was essentially useless, and they were forced to encircle the city to try and starve them out. This proved to be ineffective as well, due to the Song having a massive number of supplies within the city. Eventually, Kublai Khan sent the Persian experts to help with the siege, and they constructed massive new counterweight trebuchets, which had 3 times the range and 6 times the destructive power as the regular trebuchets. This nullified the Song's defenses and meant that in a matter of a month, the city surrendered to the Mongols. This perfectly demonstrates the technological advances made by the Mongols, as they made effective use of the engineers under their control. Additionally, it demonstrates the number of resources they now had to enact a very prolonged siege. All of these sieges throughout the decades of the Mongol Empire highlight the fact that the Mongols developed their tactics for siege warfare around their continuous technological developments. From the stone-throwing catapults used at Kai Fang and Erzgrum, to the siege engines used during the Mongol assault on Baghdad, to the powerful trebuchets used at the Xiangyang, the Mongols were always using their strengths to further progression of their siege tactics.